What is the significance of magnificence? And what does it have to do with Star Trek? It is the fate of cultural artifacts to become objects of inspiration, debate and thoughtfulness, and Star Trek is no exception. So join us now as we focus on that most innocuous of things, the size of Captain Kirk's quarters. There can't be much to ponder, surely. When I say Captain Kirk's quarters, I am of course referring to his cabin, rather than to William Shatner's buttocks, and I'm sure you are all happy to hear that. Certainly I am. But what am I referring to? In this video, we will consider the cabin of Captain Kirk through the lenses of practicality, privacy, and authority, the significance of magnificence, and then ponder a possible solution offered by the refit enterprise. Kirk's quarters in the original series consisted of two principal spaces. We will call them his day cabin, or office, perhaps living room space, and his sleeping cabin. Both had their own door leading out into the ship's corridor. There was also a third door leading off from the sleeping cabin, which we can reasonably suppose led to a bathroom. In the motion picture, Kirk's quarters were reimagined, but the basics remained. There was a slender vestibule leading into the sleeping cabin, and to the left, a pair of transparent sliding doors opened to reveal the day cabin. In both cases, original series and feature film, the sets were designed to be reused as the quarters for other characters. There are issues in their design and placement in both the original series and the feature film, which we will consider here. One issue with Kirk's quarters, in both the original series and the films, lies with direct access, or the lack thereof, between the captain's quarters and the bridge. The captain's quarters were all the way down on deck 5, or E-deck. This was some distance from the bridge, where the captain's immediate presence would be extremely necessary in an emergency. In the real world, it is seldom the case that a commanding officer's quarters are at such a distance from the command center of a ship. The early 20th century American Proteus-class colliers were particular exceptions. These were four, one of which was the infamous USS Cyclops, which disappeared with all hands inside the so-called Bermuda Triangle. The other three sisters included the Proteus herself, and the Nereus also vanished at sea. The Jupiter survived to be refitted into the first American aircraft carrier USS Langley, but was eventually sunk during the Second World War. The captain's cabin was at one end of the Proteus class, and the bridge was at the other, a distance of at least 400 feet. And yet, the Proteus sisters did have a spare cabin just off the bridge, and so in questionable weather, the captain could be at hand in case of an emergency. I shall not claim it was this distance from captain's cabin to bridge that was the main contributing factor in the loss of 3 of these ships, but it could not have been helpful. We can speculate that someone in the Next Generation production team recognized the practicality of having a room for the captain close by, for the Enterprise D had a ready room for Captain Picard, and it was right there, next to the main bridge, with excellent and fast access to the bridge. A similar room existed on the NX-01 of the series Enterprise. On the original Enterprise, if Kirk was in his quarters on deck 5 and the ship went to red alert, he would have had to leave his cabin, make his way along a corridor full of other people hurrying to their action stations, and then access a turbo lift. This turbo lift would have had to be held back long enough for him to board, for otherwise those very same other people would have caught it and Kirk would have had to wait for another turbo lift. Not only that, but if he caught the turbo lift, would he have priority? This might seem like a silly question. After all, he was the captain. But what if the turbo lift was full of desperately needed damage control teams? Might he find himself making a little diversion? The captain's quarters need to be close to the bridge, but there is another aspect of Kirk's quarters to consider. In the motion picture, Kirk's quarters had a single entrance leading into the corridor. The bunk was directly across the sleeping cabin from the entrance, whilst off to one side, in what we can think of as the private area of the cabin, was the day cabin. It really should have been the other way around, the day cabin area acting as the intermediary space between the very public corridor and the very private sleeping cabin. And yet, as it was, the characters entered the day cabin by passing through the sleeping cabin. This arrangement did give us a splendid shot in the film of the transparent doors closing on a metaphorically and literally isolated James Kirk, which was probably the intention of director Robert Wise. But speaking practically, this eroded the privacy element of the captain's quarters. Consider a scene in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. A junior officer is speaking to Captain Sulu. Sulu is in his bunk. Imagine you're a junior officer and you walk past this scene. You glance in, and there you see your commanding officer in his gym jams. It's hardly a scene to inspire respect, is it? This brings us to the erosion of Kirk's position. Why were Kirk's quarters so like those of his fellow but subordinate officers? He was the captain, so he and his quarters ought to have reflected his position. Here we have a version of the Nautilus of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Much of the internal space of the Nautilus is given over to Captain Nemo. Nemo gets a dining room, a library and a drawing room with an organ and windows, whilst the crew's quarters are confined to this limited space. Such an unequal division of space within the Nautilus, however, is not so remarkable. Here is HMS Victory, and these windows at the stern brought light into the quarters of Captain Hardy, Admiral Lord Nelson, and the officers' wardroom. They had windows and wood carvings and space and comfort, relatively speaking. Why did they get this and not the ordinary sailor? Because they were important, they were in charge. Such things are not confined to ship captains, of course. His Majesty the King, after all, does not live in a council house. His main official residence is Buckingham Palace. The President of the United States lives in the Executive Mansion, better known as the White House. It is not simply a house, but a mansion, and a mansion standing on prime real estate. As I pointed out in my video on the Enterprise D bridge, the Enterprise was not a democracy. Neither was Starfleet. It was a strict hierarchy. Admiral, Commodore, Captain, Commander, Lieutenant Commander, Lieutenant, Lieutenant Junior Grade, Ensign, Cadet. Note that Star Trek borrows from the US Navy. Outside of the officers, there were yeomen and chiefs, although a surprising few were explicitly named or featured in Star Trek, apart from Janice Rand and the greatness that was Miles O'Brien. Seemingly, almost everyone was an officer in Star Trek, which is rather telling. Traditionally, the officer class was made up of the aristocracy, and the aristocracy distinguished themselves from the common man through the use of titles and large grand houses, amongst other things. They were rich and they were powerful. Today's aristocracy may have less use of titles, at least for now, but they understand the significance of magnificence. The number of rooms in a house is often thought to indicate the wealth and importance of its resident. A house with 3 bedrooms will never be as impressive as a house with 20 bedrooms. Unless those 2 bedrooms are very, very large, of course. Consider the daddy of all European palaces, the Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV understood the importance of projecting an aura of authority through the manipulation of image, and the best means of this was, and is, through magnificence. So, why did the design of Captain Kirk's quarters ignore the significance of magnificence? Indeed, why did those quarters seem to undermine the captain's authority? Why were they so small? Well, there may be 2 possible reasons. The first is simply one of budget. The second may be a reflection of the liberal progressive philosophy so traditionally a part of Star Trek. All are mostly equal aboard the Enterprise, this starship Earth. The problem is that, in context of a starship, moreover a Starfleet based loosely on a fighting navy, it was rather misplaced. In the real world, Kirk would have needed to project authority and power in order to command, especially in such a high-stress environment as deep space. His orders would have had to be obeyed without being questioned and challenged by his subordinates. If you can see the most senior officer on the ship in his gym jams, lying on his bunk in a small unremarkable cabin, then his authority is not going to be strengthened, but weakened. In the real world, forcing Captain Kirk into an ordinary cabin, a cabin just like that of any other officer, would erode his authority by making him seem ordinary, by dragging him down to the level of mere equal. His exceptionalism threatened. Given the hierarchical nature of rank aboard the Enterprise, this is curious. Of course, there were more practical reasons for Kirk's lack of grander quarters. The television budget of the original series and of the feature films might not have stretched so far as to have a large and unique set for Captain Kirk. A captain quarters set fit for a senior officer. Let us not forget Lieutenant Ilea's quarters in the motion picture were, indeed, smaller than Kirk's. But let's have some fun by theorizing what we might have got had things been different. In the era of wooden walls and sail power, warships had a great cabin at the stern for the commanding officer. What Captain Kirk should have had was the Enterprise equivalent. The refit Enterprise offers us a solution that solves the distance problem by being close to the bridge, and also demonstrates the captain's exceptionalism over all other officers so necessary for authority and command. Often theorized to be a part of the officers' and VIPs' lounge complex, these windows evoke the great cabin of yesteryear. We saw through them during the scenes involving the arrival of Spock's shuttle, but apart from that, Star Trek offered nothing more. And yet, this is a good place to have a refit Enterprise equivalent of a great cabin. There would be space for a proper captain's office. He could hold dinners for his officers and himself, which offer the writer opportunities for interplay between characters in a formal or informal setting. Such quarters would be close to the bridge, but most of all, such quarters would reflect a Starfleet understanding of the significance of magnificence.